first question is for Pablo. And I was curious, I feel like the royalty pharma is kind of like a commercial pathway of the drug or biotech company. It's very enticing. So I was curious, so first of all, two questions. First of all, what's your criteria when you're choosing royalty of a drug? Basically, which drug you choose, what's the criteria for that? Secondly, when you're trying to buy some royalty from the company, how do you your prices usually will below the fair price or whatever. How do you make sure that you have more insight than those sellers, and then you can get a good return from your
So the answer to the first question is that over 20 years of investing in this industry, we have made a lot of mistakes and lost money from our mistakes, and learned that there's about 10 attributes that we want to see in a product for us to get interested. And we become very disciplined. And the way we approach the business today is that we have these 10 attributes, which are, I'll quickly maybe mention a few. Like, for example, we would like to invest in a biologic as opposed to a small molecule. Biologic, has better IP protection. They're, more difficult to copy or replicate. Versus a small, they have other attributes, but and that doesn't mean that we don't invest in a small molecule, but the biologic would score higher in that criteria. Other things are marketer. There's great marketers, and it doesn't necessarily mean that every big pharma is going to be a great marketer for all therapeutic classes, so that is important. The indication, if it's a serious disease like cancer, HIV/AIDS, multiple sclerosis, where we have invested a lot, is more attractive than a chronic disease. So anyway, there's about 10 of these attributes, and what's happened is that we become very disciplined. If the drug scores high in 9 or 10 of those attributes, we're very interested. If it scores high in 2 or 3 or 4, we're not going to get close because we're going to lose money. So that's the way we've approached it. And the answer to the second question, which was...
how do you make sure you have a better...
Correct.
Effect?
So the business is not predicated on us outsmarting, for example, Memorial Sloan Kettering, which sold us a royalty, or UCLA, which sold us a royalty last year. They get advisors which are smart, and they look at the potential sales of the drug and do a very careful analysis. But the reality is that if I buy a royalty for a low teens return, 10, 12, 14% return, discounting the future cash flows, first of all, we're diversified. So we're able to mitigate risk through diversification, which is not the case with an academic institution. And secondly, the low cost of debt financing that we have has been a great part of the story, because we're using half of the capital as debt that we can issue at LIBOR plus 175 today to LIBOR plus 225, depending on the duration of our debt. That really boosts the returns to sort of high teens, which make it very attractive. And what's happened is that, through careful selection, we have been able to invest in products that have outperformed the expectations. And maybe the forecast we did were conservative, the forecast that the industry analysts did were conservative, but we always try to invest in situations where there's more chances of that drug outperforming than it underperforming. And that has resulted in some outperformance of the entire portfolio, which has also increased the returns.
Other questions? Yes?
The idea of a player-coach relationship between a VC and a biotech entrepreneur was mentioned. I'm curious if you guys could speak to what that relationship is like, what the advice being provided is.
Sure.
Why don't you go first?
Sure. I think venture capitalists can do a lot to get a company started, and often we're there in operating roles. But at the end of the day, we're about backing people. And so it's really having seen, I've been involved with 50 companies in my career so far, and having seen different situations and different patterns, and being able to, like a good coach, be able to apply those. Where Bob is a true entrepreneur and academic, but as an entrepreneur, I can sort of give my advice and be a really great partner in those moments when you need advice. Now, the truth of the matter is he's a spectacular entrepreneur, and so he doesn't need a lot of advice. But as good partners, when those moments come, I can sort of lend my voice to those critical moments.
Yeah, I'd make a few comments. I mean, so first of all, they're not always perfect relationships any more than they are in baseball. He happens to be a great coach, and I think a lot of it's just his attitude about fairness and things like that. I would say there's plenty of venture capitalists that I don't think they see that as what they necessarily do. I mean, because they're appropriately so, to make money. I mean, Terry's approach, I think, has been to do it for the long run, and I think that's paid off for him and that's why he gets people returning to him. But I don't know that everybody thinks that way. I also feel, and this is just for me, like I think there's certain things I'm good at. I think I can do pretty good science. But as I said, in my part, there's a lot of elements to success. The biggest one, and I wish I didn't have to say this, but I do, is I think the CEO, which is a business person. And I think a good business person is, I shouldn't put it this way. It's much easier for somebody in the business area to pull the wool over my eyes than it is to do it for him, because that's the world he's lived in. And so I feel like that's also this partnership in, like I can help on the scientific things and the patents, but the partnership, it goes much further, because really when I look at companies that have worked well, usually, especially in biotech, they often need there's a high risk, there's easy to fail. So you need a lot of runway. You need to be creative about the financing, and you need to hire, really good business people. So I think that's been a team effort on those as well.
Actually, let me add one comment to that. Terry's won a number of awards, but the one award that I want to mention that he's too modest to mention is that in 2009, there's a website called The Funded, which is a website that's frequented by CEOs and founders of all sorts of entrepreneurial ventures. I think 20,000 CEOs are on that site. And on that site, they do a survey annually of which venture capitalist do the CEOs love the most. That's the word, the most loved venture capitalist. 2009, Terry won that award. And I've never heard of CEOs referring to their VCs as people that they love until then. So congratulations, Terry. That actually makes a very big difference and explains a lot, I think, about the success.
Well, one of the things, and Bob and I have had this conversation before, which is, many of the things that we learn as partners, we learn from our parents, which is, be fair, be candid, treat people the way you want to be treated. And unfortunately, many venture capitalists think of it as a transaction, not as a relationship. And we've been together now for almost 30 years, actually. If you think of all the companies we've been, this is a true marriage of sorts. And so just treat people like you want to be treated, which sounds like something that you tell a second grader, but unfortunately not enough people in our industry understand that.
I think one of the most interesting things I've noticed about people that turn out to be really good in business is also people that are fair, going to your point, that in many cases, when you're an investor and you have capital and companies need capital, you're in a position of leverage, and you can, take advantage of that leverage. But the reality is that, if that's the way you behave, then, you will be known as someone that is not fair in business and, taking advantage of that situation. And I think it's difficult, but one of the most important things is to actually, try not to do that and behave in a way where you're being totally fair with your partners, because you want them to be partners for the long run. And what happens, which is this incredible example of these two gentlemen, is how many things they've done together in business, which is repeated. And that's really, I think the reason, I'm sure you're one of the most fair VC investors there, and that's why you have this return, business. And anyway, that's a incredible example of something that's so critical in business.
Monique, and then Kara.
Two questions. You all alluded to sort of this macro environment. The U.S. government investments in science is at risk and threatened. How much, if at all, are you concerned about this for the model of sort of government invests in academia and then VC and then pharma? Second question is, on your checklist of what are the 10 attributes, or what's the formula, any comments on vaccines in general and where they fit? I know you mentioned Lipitor and sort of the enormous value that it has to healthcare savings because of that drug. Arguably, vaccines provide enormous value to individuals and the healthcare system, but are really minimally valued as far as price perspective. So, any thoughts on
I'll let you guys do where the vaccines fit in. But research, well, I think we're concerned. I mean, I think in general, academia should be concerned and business should be concerned. I mean, NIH has been a great source. I think we are fortunate that, you know, this is a time when there are more and more foundations too. But there's the NIH, and even the NIH, I think some of the things they're talking about are ridiculous, that now you can have, and that's not coming from Trump. I mean, there's enough bad things he's doing, but you know, they just are talking about that you could have, you know, nobody should have more than 3 grants or something like that. You know, which just seems to me now they're gonna try to fund, you know, I mean, that will reduce the quality of, you know, that will reduce quality. So I think that it's a concern to me broadly what happens at NIH internally and externally.
On vaccines, you know, we have a couple of vaccine companies in our portfolio. And as I said before, the way we've approached investing is to always try diversity. But vaccines has been out of favor. I mean, and I think it has to do with the business model itself. One is the prices are low. It's not a chronically administered therapy. And so in some sense, from a prevention perspective, it saves so much money, and you'd hope it would get, the value would be captured. But the value capture has been really challenging. And so, again, we continue to invest. But I wouldn't bet an entire portfolio on vaccines because of that challenge. I don't know if you have any.
Yeah, maybe I'll just add about NIH and the critical role that it plays in life sciences. One of the things that you sort of see in one of the charts that I showed is this ecosystem, and it's not only NIH, but it's, you know, the biotech industry and venture capital. And what's really extraordinary about this country, and I'm an immigrant, I came here 30 years ago, is that this ecosystem that exists, that has been working for 40 years and developed over time, it's very difficult to replicate. Super, super difficult. Why? Because, for venture capitalists to work together with scientists, to get to work together with, even lawyers that are involved in IP, all of these pieces have to work together and work together well to have the success that we have had. And it's, I've heard a lot about, Singapore trying to make biotechnology a priority. They haven't accomplished much. China is a real threat because of the scale. And, I'm starting to hear, I don't know if you heard this or not, but venture capitalists the other day was telling me that they're starting to actually create more biotech companies per year than the US, which was a shock to me. So I think, it is a big concern to me because the NIH is really at the top of this cascade that results in this incredible industry. And if we mess around with that, it's not gonna be a good thing. And we should really, all of you, if you can, please, try to get involved in talking to people and making sure that this doesn't happen, because it will be really detrimental for this ecosystem.
Carol? And then Joe?
To hear a little bit more about, kind of the relationship of, the early science into VC, and just a little bit more around how that actually gets formed initially. I mean, obviously you two have worked together for quite a while, but for any given kind of technology, like at what point is it put on your radar, and kind of who initiates the conversation? How do you figure out how much is needed, and just kind of how does that process work? How much
Sure. In some ways, it's pretty simple, which is I'll get a call or an email from Bob who said there's an interesting project that they're working on, and often it's with a postdoc or some collaborator that's also meaningful. And so we'll sit down, and typically when we get that call, it's actually pretty easy for us, which is let's find a way to fund it. We also try to find a way to fund it in such a way that the founders have a lot of the equity, because I think one of the other issues that venture capitalists do is they overfund companies in the beginning. And the only bad thing that happens there is that the founders get diluted down. And so we try to avoid that. So typically by the time Bob calls with something, he's given a lot of thought. And I think we've been a 95% hit rate from when we've gotten those calls. And so I think it's relying on him. But what's unique about Bob is that, given he's started so many companies, he knows what's great commercial science and what's great research science. And so having that eye, we'll get calls from other friends and that we know that are academics that don't have that keen eye for what can be translated, and then you'll sit and vet the deals. But actually, in the case of Bob, it's a pretty simple call.
Yeah, it's also, I think it's fair to say it's evolved over time. You know, if I go back early on, whether it's me or other people, when you don't know somebody, you know, you have no relationship, it's very different than now when two of my former students are, you know, working at Polaris and they know all the stuff and a lot of the people in our lab. So I think it's really evolved. I think, you know, when I first started doing it, I mean, I probably subconsciously used those criteria that I mentioned, you know, that we'd have patents, we'd have papers, we'd be fairly advanced, have animal studies. And then, yeah, then I'd probably talk to Terry or say, you know, this is, you know, something that might be a company, and that's how AIR started. And, you know, or it could be one of his partners too, because we have a close relationship with some of them, especially my students, but Amy Shulman, who I mentioned as well. So I think, so I sort of see it as evolving over time, you know, from where, you know, we would really have a conversation about whether to do it or not, to now it kind of almost happens spontaneously. And it's not just me and it's not just Terry, it's like a whole ecosystem of people on both sides.
And I guess to that point of it being an ecosystem, there's so many players, are there ever like bidding wars or, you know, like there's multiple people trying to get in? I guess how do you navigate that?
Well, if we do it ourselves, I mean, that's a good question. You know, if we do it ourselves, if it just comes from our lab internally, you know, usually we'd be talking to Terry. You know, there's been plenty of times, though, when things don't just come from our lab, when somebody comes to see us and there's a collaboration and somebody else talks to somebody else, and sometimes those people do want bidding awards. I basically don't like that, you know, but I think it depends on the situation.
Okay, well, so, Terry, you want to?
Yeah, just one other comment, which is I do remember it would be typical for an entrepreneur to approach a venture capitalist and say, here's my idea. And you hear about this 1 out of 10 or 1 out of 100. But I do remember pulling Bob aside when I saw him present some technology one time and saying, hey, Bob, shouldn't we start a company around that technology? And he said, it's a really cool technology. It's going to be important technology, but the time is wrong. So that trust, which is, I mean, because a lot of people would say, sure, give me some money, where, you know, it's not about the money. He's looking for successful research to be commercialized. And so that sort of trust and that candor is really important.
So we're running out of time, and what I'd like to do is we'll have one last question from Joan, and then after that, I'm going to ask each of the 3 panelists to maybe give a 2-minute kind of a bit of advice for students who are thinking about getting into the space, and what you would say is the main thing that they ought to be thinking about. So, Joan?
I just have a question with academic medical centers. The patient revenue streams are decreasing. And do you see this as the future for their survival financially? Is it going to be the development partnership with venture capital, joint ventures with businesses, analytics of their data set? Is that going to be, and selling of the royalties? Do you see that as becoming a bigger source of their revenue as they face these issues with
Yeah, that's probably.
Sure. You know, we're seeing, of course, Boston is blessed with these fantastic medical centers, and we're seeing them do all the above. You know, the reality is that many of them are talking about how do they take their technology and commercialize it. Actually, reflecting on Pablo's list, actually there were Boston hospitals on that list, right? So they're clearly an important source of new technology. I see them trying to start companies. I see them, essentially, some of them, like Partners, has a venture capital fund itself. So they're really definitely deep into this ecosystem, and I think they're trying to look at each way. Some of them are trying to figure out ways to monetize their data sets. So I think yes, 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 and yes, and I think it's because of they're looking for more sources of capital to advance their science.
How do you see the Harvard versus
Well, to be clear, Harvard, you know, every pot on its own bottom. Is that the expression at Harvard? You know, so each institute is its own. And so I see actually there's a bridge program between MIT and some of the Harvard hospitals. So I view them as being different. I actually find, I'd say this to anyone at Harvard, I find MIT to be the easiest group to work with because they're the most experienced and they've done so many of these things. And so, but I think Harvard has been a good source of technology, and we've licensed a lot of technology out of Harvard. So I wouldn't compare and contrast too much. They're both great sources.
Maybe just adding to the Harvard versus MIT remark, we actually, a couple of years ago, had our board meeting here, and we spent half a day with our board at MIT looking at technology that had been developed here, and many scientists speaking to us and some guests that we invited, and we spent the afternoon at Harvard. It was shocking, the contrast with how people here at MIT had their minds much more attuned to commercialization of inventions, and practical approaches and pragmatic approaches to commercialize, versus Harvard, which was much more basic science and academic. And I'm not suggesting that one is good and the other one is bad. Both are needed. But to me, it was a clear difference between the two institutions. Another comment I will make is that, Andrew has been trying to push this idea of creating a mega fund to fund early stage research, which would be an amazing complement to all of the other things that we've talked about today. And, hopefully soon that will get off the ground. And if it happens, it would be just great for, to supplement the capital that is needed, to get things off the ground. The last thing I would say is that, maybe a little bit in the line of sort of suggestions. I think you are lucky, all of you, honestly, to be part of this incredible country ecosystem that has produced so much, innovation, invention relative to the rest of the world. I mean, I count myself in that group, and it's just extraordinary what's happening in this country. We're really starting to live sort of the golden age of life sciences with this convergence of technology and biology. And it's so exciting. There's capital that's needed, and that's one big concern because there's so many good ideas. But all of you, if you want to get into this field, it's just an amazing time to get into this field. And I think Boston itself is just an extraordinary place. I remember when I started this business, the belief was that California was a much better place to be. And more and more I hear that the cutting edge stuff, the real exciting things are being developed in the Boston community. And I recently saw some data that might give you a little bit of a sense of also, how this whole industry has developed. Turns out that there's something like 100, and this is data from about 4 or 5 years ago, it may have changed, but there's something like 100 million square feet of lab space around the world. Of that 100 million square feet in life sciences, there's about 80 million that are in the U.S. Again, that shows you, the predominant position the U.S. has. And of the 80 million square feet of lab space in the U.S., 30 million is California. Now that's spread out between, San Francisco, San Diego, a little bit in L.A., and then 30 million is essentially, I don't know if it's 1 or 2 miles around here, but it's all concentrated here and around Kendall Square. Obviously, outside of Boston, there's a lot of things happening, but it's amazing that there's such concentration of talent in this area. And then in the U.S., the remainder, which is essentially 20 million square feet, is spread out, in Austin and Research Triangle Park and other places. But the really two important poles are California and Boston. And Boston has really started to take a lead. So, you're in the right place and in the right industry, in my view. If you look at, what's going to happen, what are going to be the growing industries, the industries that are going to create value in the long term. In my mind, this is no question, one of at the very, very top of the list. So anyway, that's all
Terry? Words of advice?
Oh, sure. The theme that you probably picked up from me already is it's all about people. And I would sort of say, if I were starting a company, and if many of you are, I would sort of say pick your partners very carefully. And also be very self-aware of what you're good at and what you're not good at. I mean, one of the beauties of working with Bob is I know I'm not a great scientist, and he's a spectacular scientist. I think I can add value on the business side, as he referenced. And I think figuring out that dynamic is, because I've seen a lot of people get launched thinking they can do everything, and in fact they can. And so just sort of this very candid self-assessment is something that I encourage people, but also go for the risk, take a shot. And I've seen too many people talk themselves away from doing that, and that's what they should do.
Yeah, well, I think it really goes, to me, it goes back to what I said before, and I don't limit it to business. I mean, I think, you want to do something with your life that you feel will have a big impact, that you feel passionate about. And I wouldn't do it for the money. I'd do it for the impact, however you feel you want to have an impact. So I always think it's important to dream big dreams, dreams that can change the world. I also think, and this relates to what Terry said and also what I said in my talk, that you're going to run into a ton of obstacles when you try to do that. And don't give up. I mean, I think people that are successful are dreamers, but they're also incredibly persistent in whatever they do. And I mean, you see great examples with Terry and Pablo in different ways. And I think that it's just dream big and don't give up.
Well, on that note, on behalf of the entire class, I want to thank the three of you for coming and sharing your wisdom with us. And on behalf of families and patients around the world, thank you for doing what you're doing.
We also have to thank this man for what he's done for this industry, and I think that's really critical, Andrew. And you've been an inspiration to many, and I hope that we continue to collaborate. But thank you for what you've done.
Thank you. Appreciate it.